Part 1, The Hollow Walls. October 31st had always been my favorite day of the year. I loved the eerie atmosphere, the decorations, and that sweet scent of unease that drifted through the autumn air. This Halloween, though, felt different. The house, my house, seemed wrong. My friend Thomas had come over early, around 5 p.m., to help set up. The porch was already covered in cobwebs, glowing pumpkin lamps flickered in the dusk, and plastic skeletons hung from every corner. Inside, the long dining table was set with gory treats, gummy eyeballs, blood-soaked finger cookies, and pumpkin soup that steamed in the dim light of the fake torches lining the walls. By 6 p.m., we were sitting down, eating in our costumes. I was a vampire, complete with a cape that dragged on the floor, while Thomas came dressed as a zombie, half his face caked in fake blood. As the night grew darker, we turned on all the decorations, watching as the house transformed into a scene straight out of a horror movie. It was perfect. At least, for a while. Around 8 p.m., Thomas excused himself to use the bathroom. I was finishing my drink, a mix we jokingly called witch's brew, when I heard a noise. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. Like something moving, behind the walls. A soft scraping sound, almost rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across the wood. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination. After all, it was Halloween, the night when all things creepy felt more real. Thomas came back and suggested we take the decorations outside for a bigger scare. That was when things started to spiral into something far worse than either of us had imagined. At 9 p.m., we stepped outside with our pumpkin lamps in hand. The street was quiet, eerily so. We placed pieces of paper around the neighborhood, preparing for the silly Slender Man ritual we had planned. Slender Man, come. Slender Man, come, we called, half laughing as we wandered through the deserted streets. And then the lights in the house flickered. Thomas, standing next to me, frowned. "That's weird, isn't it?" he muttered. I nodded, feeling a cold prickle crawl up my spine. The laughter that had bubbled between us just moments ago vanished, replaced by a silence so thick, it felt as though the night was holding its breath. We headed back inside, but as soon as we stepped through the door, the temperature dropped sharply. It felt like the air itself had turned to ice. The walls groaned, as if the house was alive, shifting, breathing in the darkness. And then, the scratching started again. Louder this time. Clearer. It wasn't my imagination. Something was inside the walls. Part 2, Whispers in the Dark. Thomas glanced at me, eyes wide with alarm. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. I didn't respond right away, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching was unmistakable now, like claws scraping just beyond the wallpaper. It was impossible to ignore. "Yeah," I finally muttered, forcing myself to take a step deeper into the house. We stood in the hallway, the dim lights casting long shadows across the walls. I could see my breath in the cold air, little puffs of mist, and each one seemed to hang just a little too long before dissipating. The sound was growing louder, more frantic, as if something was desperate to get out. "We should check the fuse box," Thomas suggested, his voice shaky. "Maybe it's just some wiring problem." I nodded, glad to have an excuse to move. The thought of standing still, waiting for whatever was causing that sound to reveal itself, was unbearable. We moved quickly, heading to the basement where the fuse box was located. I hadn't been down there in months. The stairs creaked beneath our feet as we descended, the darkness swallowing us up as soon as we left the safety of the dim hallway light. I fumbled for the switch at the top of the stairs, but the basement remained dark. "Damn it," I muttered, pulling out my phone to use the flashlight. The narrow beam of light illuminated the cold stone walls and the cluttered floor filled with forgotten boxes. The scratching noise had followed us down here, it seemed to echo from all around. "What the hell is that?" Thomas asked, moving the light to the corner of the basement where the sound was loudest. We approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The noise was coming from the farthest corner of the basement, behind an old wooden cabinet that had been left there by the previous owners. I hadn't thought much of it when I moved in, assuming it was just an old piece of junk too heavy to haul out. As we got closer, the scratching intensified, frantic and insistent. I held my breath, my heart racing, as I reached for the cabinet's edge. "Wait." Thomas grabbed my arm. "Are you sure we should?" "Too late." I pulled the cabinet aside, revealing the wall behind it. A large, deep crack split the plaster, and from that crack, came the sound. It was no longer scratching, it was a whisper. A voice, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably human. I staggered back, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What the fuck?" Thomas was frozen, staring at the crack in the wall as the whisper grew louder. It was like someone was speaking just out of reach, their words garbled and disjointed, but pleading. Desperate. "Help, me." My blood ran cold. I could feel a primal fear rising in me, every instinct screaming to get out of there, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my eyes locked on the crack. Thomas, wide-eyed, shook his head. This can't be real." The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. For a moment, everything was still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then the walls groaned again, louder this time. And something much larger than before, began moving behind the wall. The crack widened, a sickening creak filling the basement as though the house was splitting apart. "I think we need to leave," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded slowly, but before we could move, a hand, pale, skeletal, slid through the crack in the wall. Part 3, The Pale Hand. The sight of that hand reaching out from the wall paralyzed me. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, the fingers impossibly long and thin. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that it had to be some elaborate Halloween prank. But as the fingers flexed, and the hand scraped against the plaster, sending pieces of the wall crumbling to the floor, the reality of it hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Thomas stumbled backward, knocking into a pile of old boxes. "What the hell is that?" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. I couldn't answer him. My eyes were fixed on the hand as it clawed further through the crack, dragging more of the wall down with it. There was a faint, wet sound, like something slick and heavy shifting behind the walls, and the stench of rot filled the air, making me gag. The hand paused, fingers twitching, and then it retreated, disappearing back into the darkness behind the wall. For a split second, everything was still again. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I almost missed the next sound. Almost. The whisper returned. Only this time, it wasn't garbled or distant. It was clear, sharp, and far too close for comfort. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was feminine, but there was something wrong about it. It echoed unnaturally, as though the sound was bouncing around inside my skull, too loud, too real. I stumbled backward, clutching at my ears, but it didn't stop. "Leave now, before it's too late." Thomas grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the stairs. "We need to get out of here, now." His face was pale, and I could see the raw panic in his eyes. I didn't need any more convincing. We bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over ourselves in our haste. The moment we reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, even though I knew deep down it wouldn't do any good. For a moment, we just stood there, panting, our breaths ragged and uneven. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could still hear the whisper echoing in my mind, replaying over and over again. "You shouldn't have come here." "What the hell was that?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What the hell is in your house, man?" I shook my head, still trying to process what I had seen. The cold sweat clung to my skin, and my thoughts were racing. "I don't know," I whispered. I stopped mid-sentence. There was something off about the house, something I hadn't noticed before. The decorations were still on, the pumpkin lamps casting an eerie orange glow, but they were flickering more erratically now. The temperature hadn't returned to normal. If anything, it had gotten even colder. And then, from upstairs, I heard a creak. A slow, deliberate creak that sent a shiver down my spine. We both froze, our heads snapping toward the staircase. The noise came again, footsteps. But they weren't mine. Or Thomas's. My pulse quickened. There's someone upstairs. Thomas looked at me, his face pale with dread. No one else is here, right? No, I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. It's just us. The footsteps continued, slow and heavy, moving across the floor above us. They were heading toward the staircase. We didn't say a word. Both of us were too terrified to move, too terrified to make a sound. All I could do was stare at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for whatever was coming. I swallowed hard, trying to think. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as though the house itself was pressing down on us. Those whispers from the basement still buzzed in my ears, like a warning. And then, the footsteps stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. No creaking, no scratching. Just silence. And then something else, something worse, broke the quiet. The voice from the basement, clearer now, sharper, as though it was just inches away. It's too late. And the footsteps resumed, faster this time, pounding down the stairs toward us. Part 4, The Thing on the Stairs. The pounding footsteps barreled down the stairs, fast and heavy, like something far too large for the creaky old steps. Thomas and I stood frozen, wide-eyed, unable to tear our gaze away from the staircase. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare, waiting for something to lunge out of the darkness. I could hear my heart in my ears, each beat a dull thud of terror. The footsteps were almost at the bottom now, and my breath caught in my throat. Thomas grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard, as though he needed something solid to cling to. And then the thing reached the bottom of the stairs. There was a shape, tall and hunched, barely visible in the flickering light from the pumpkin lamps. The air seemed to ripple around it, like it was warping reality itself. I couldn't make out any distinct features, just an outline, dark and jagged, as though it didn't belong in the world of the living. The air turned icy, and that foul stench from the basement returned, stronger now, filling the room with the sickly sweet odor of decay. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot. Thomas let out a small whimper, his grip on my arm tightening as the figure shifted. It wasn't walking toward us, it was floating, hovering just above the floor, its limbs twisted and jerking unnaturally as it moved. Get out. The voice from the basement echoed in my head again, but now it seemed to be coming from the figure in front of us. The same feminine tone, sharp and filled with malice. Get out while you can. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure's outline flickered in and out, like a bad signal on a TV, as though it was fighting to stay in this reality. Thomas broke the silence. What the hell is that? He whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if what we were seeing was real. The longer I stared at it, the more unreal it seemed, like my brain was rejecting what my eyes were showing me. But the fear in my chest, the cold sweat on my skin, that was real. The thing hovered closer, just inches away now. I could feel its cold breath on my face, rancid and thick. Its shape flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw something I'll never forget, eyes. Deep, hollow pits where its eyes should have been, staring straight at me. And then, just as quickly, the thing vanished. Gone, like it had never been there at all. Thomas and I stood there, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room felt different, lighter, like the weight of the house had momentarily lifted. But the cold still lingered, and the smell, that smell was worse than ever. What the fuck was that? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I muttered, still trying to catch my breath. But whatever it was, it's not gone. As if in response, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, the house groaned, the sound reverberating through the walls. That scratching noise from before returned, louder, as though the house was full of it now, coming from every direction. Jesus Christ, Thomas muttered. We need to get out of here. I nodded. He was right. Whatever was in the house, it wasn't just confined to the basement anymore. It was in the walls, in the very fabric of the place, and it was waking up. We need to go, I said, my voice steadying as I grabbed Thomas's arm. Now. We turned to leave, but as we reached the front door, a loud bang echoed through the house, stopping us in our tracks. It was coming from upstairs. Didn't you say no one else was here? Thomas asked, his voice barely masking his fear. I nodded, my stomach knotting up. There shouldn't be anyone upstairs. The house was locked, the windows all closed. We were the only ones. But now, someone, or something, was up there. We stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the dark hallway above. I could see the outline of the door to the master bedroom, barely visible in the dim light. It was open, wide open, when I knew I'd shut it earlier. Thomas swallowed hard. We're not going up there, right? Another loud bang came from the bedroom, like furniture being overturned. My skin prickled, my mind racing through every possible explanation. But there was only one conclusion I could come to. Whatever was in the basement, I said slowly, it's not just in the walls anymore. Thomas shook his head, backing away. No. No way. We need to get out of this house, now. I wanted to agree. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run and never look back. But something compelled me to stay. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the house itself wouldn't let us go. I need to see what's up there, I whispered. Thomas looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Are you insane? You just saw what that thing. I know, I cut him off. But I need to know what's going on. There's something in this house, and it won't stop until we figure out what it is. He hesitated, looking from me to the stairs and back again. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. Fine. But if we die, I'm haunting your ass. Together, we started up the stairs, each step slower than the last. The air felt heavier with every inch we climbed, like we were being suffocated by the house itself. The closer we got to the top, the louder the banging became, and I could swear I heard whispering behind it. When we reached the top, we paused, staring down the long hallway. The door to the master bedroom was still open, and beyond it, something moved in the shadows. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped into the room. Part 5, the master bedroom. The master bedroom felt colder than the rest of the house, and as soon as we stepped inside, I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. The room had always been unsettling, it was one of the few spaces I hadn't fully redecorated since moving in. There was something about the dark, heavy curtains, the old, creaking floorboards, and the antique furniture left behind by the previous owners that made the room feel haunted. But tonight, it was different. The air hummed with a strange energy, and the shadows seemed to shift and twist unnaturally. The bed, which had once been neatly made, was now a mess of tangled sheets, as if someone, or something, had been thrashing around in it. The closet door stood wide open, creaking gently on its hinges, as though it had been flung open just moments before. Thomas stood just behind me, his breath shallow and quick. I don't like this, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Something's not right in here. I couldn't argue with that. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out, to run, but there was something about the room, something that felt familiar. Like I'd seen it before, in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Then I noticed it. In the corner of the room, near the window, something was moving. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim light. But as I squinted, trying to focus, the shape became clearer, a figure, hunched and shivering, sitting with its back to us. I felt my throat tighten. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Thomas didn't answer, but I could hear his sharp intake of breath. He saw it too. The figure didn't move at first, just sat there, rocking gently, its head bowed. But then it began to hum, a soft, eerie tune that sent chills crawling up my spine. The same tune I'd heard before. The same melody from the whispers. It wasn't human. I could feel that in my bones. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet heavy like they were sinking into the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and every breath felt like a battle. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure stopped rocking, the humming cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. Then, slowly, it began to rise. The way it moved was wrong, its limbs jerked unnaturally, like a puppet with its strings tangled. It stood tall, much taller than I had expected, towering over me with its back still turned. I took a step back, my skin crawling with the sense that something terrible was about to happen. "Thomas," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the figure turned. I gasped, stumbling back as I got my first full look at it. It was a woman, or at least, it had been. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes. God, her eyes. Hollow and empty, like black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her jaw unhinged unnaturally wide, as though she was frozen in the moment of her last breath. But it was her face, that struck me like a punch to the gut. I knew her. I had seen that face before, in old photographs tucked away in the attic when I first moved in. She was the previous owner's wife, the one who had disappeared without a trace. "Thomas," I choked out, backing away toward the door. That's her." His eyes darted between the ghastly figure and me, confusion and terror written all over his face. "What do you mean? Who is that?" I couldn't answer him. My mind was spinning, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle falling into place. The woman in front of me, this ghost, or whatever she was, had been haunting this house long before I ever stepped foot in it. But why? Why was she here now? The woman's head jerked to the side, her dead eyes locking onto mine, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within her chest. Her mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Then, she lunged. I screamed, ducking just in time as her skeletal hands clawed at the space where my head had been. Thomas grabbed me, pulling me back toward the hallway as the ghost thrashed wildly, her limbs flailing in all directions. Her growls filled the room, echoing off the walls, as if the very house was amplifying her fury. We stumbled out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind us. I could still hear her inside, scratching at the walls, pounding on the door, her growls growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. Thomas was shaking, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We need to get out of here," he yelled. "We can't stay in this house." I nodded, but my mind was racing. The woman's face, those photographs in the attic. There was something I hadn't told Thomas, something I had almost forgotten about. The last owner's wife hadn't just disappeared, there had been rumors, stories whispered by the neighbors when I first moved in. They said she had gone mad in this house, that she had started hearing voices in the walls, seeing things that weren't there. And then, one day, she vanished. I glanced toward the stairs leading to the attic. If there were any answers, they were up there. Hidden away in the dusty corners of this house, waiting to be uncovered. "We need to go upstairs," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Thomas looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Upstairs? Are you crazy? We need to get out of this house, now." "I can't," I whispered. "Not yet. There's something up there I need to see. Something about her." Thomas shook his head, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't want to go back in there, but he wasn't about to leave me alone. "Fine," he muttered. "But we do this fast." We turned toward the attic stairs, the sounds of the ghostly woman's growls fading behind us as we made our way up. With every step, the air grew colder, heavier, like the house itself was trying to keep us out. At the top of the stairs, the attic door loomed ahead, its old wood warped and cracked from years of neglect. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. Whatever was behind that door. I knew it was the key to everything. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. Part 6, The Attic Secrets. The attic door creaked open, revealing a black void beyond. The beam from my flashlight cut through the dust-choked air, revealing old trunks and forgotten boxes piled haphazardly along the walls. The scent of decay was stronger here, mixed with a strange, musty odor that made my skin crawl. Thomas stood behind me, his breath shallow. "I don't like this, man. This is where every horror movie goes wrong. People go into attics, and they never come back." I couldn't argue with him. But something deep inside me, something primal, was pulling me forward. This attic held the answers to everything. I could feel it. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath our weight. The air was colder up here, so cold that I could see my breath misting in the light. As I moved the flashlight around, the beam caught on something at the far end of the attic. A small door, almost hidden behind a large, antique armoire, its wood warped and discolored with age. My heart skipped a beat. I had never noticed that door before. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas nodded, his eyes locked on the door. "What the hell is this place?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I approached the door, my feet heavy with dread. As I drew closer, I noticed something etched into the wood, strange symbols, crude and jagged, like they had been carved in a hurry. They looked old, ancient even, and they sent a shiver down my spine. Without thinking, I reached for the handle, but the moment my fingers touched the cold metal, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the attic. "Don't open it." I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. The voice was unmistakable, it was the same one I had heard in the basement, the same voice that had whispered from behind the walls. It was clearer now, more powerful, and it seemed to come from all around me. Thomas grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "Did you hear that?" he hissed, panic rising in his voice. "We need to get out of here." I didn't move. My hand still hovered over the door, and something inside me, something dark and twisted, urged me to open it, to see what was behind it. I had come this far. I couldn't turn back now. The symbols on the door seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. I could feel the air around me shift, growing heavier, more oppressive, as though the house itself was watching, waiting for my next move. "Don't open it," the voice repeated, louder this time, filled with malice. But I couldn't stop myself. With a deep breath, I gripped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, and a rush of icy air poured out, nearly knocking me off my feet. Thomas cursed under his breath, backing away from the small room that lay beyond. I couldn't see much, just darkness, but there was something wrong about it. The shadows inside the room seemed to writhe and twist, like they were alive, breathing. And then, the smell hit me. It was the stench of death, thick, choking, overwhelming. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, but it did little to block out the foul odor. I shined the flashlight into the room, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The floor was littered with old, yellowed papers, some torn, others covered in thick black stains that I hoped weren't blood. There was a chair in the center of the room, old and broken, its legs splintered. But what really caught my attention was the wall directly in front of me. It was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe more, all pinned to the decaying wallpaper. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight over the images. They were old, black and white, the kind you'd find in dusty family albums from decades ago. But as I scanned the photos, I realized something terrifying. They were all of her. The woman from the master bedroom, the ghost that had attacked us, was in every single photo. In some, she was smiling, standing with a man I assumed was her husband. In others, she was alone, staring directly into the camera, her face expressionless. But the more I looked, the more the photos changed. Her smile became strained, her eyes hollow, and her skin paler. In the last few pictures, she looked like the creature we had seen in the bedroom, gaunt, skeletal, with dead eyes and an unhinged jaw. My stomach turned. Something terrible had happened to her. And it had started in this house. "Look at this," Thomas whispered, pointing to the floor near the chair. I followed the beam of his flashlight and saw a small, leather-bound journal lying in the dust, its cover cracked and worn with age. I knelt down, hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The leather felt cold in my hands, and as I flipped through the brittle pages, I could barely make out the faded handwriting. The journal belonged to the previous owner, the woman's husband. The entry started off normal, mundane details of their life together. But as I read further, the tone changed, becoming more frantic, more desperate. October 3, 1958, there's something wrong with the house. Marie says she can hear voices at night, whispering from the walls. I don't hear anything, but she's convinced it's real. She says they call her name. I told her it was just her imagination, but now I'm not so sure. October 14, 1958, the noises are getting worse. Marie doesn't sleep anymore. She stays up all night, staring at the walls, listening. She says they want something from her. I don't know what to do. She's not herself anymore. October 20, 1958, Marie is gone. I woke up this morning, and she was gone. The door to the attic was open, and I found her clothes up there, but no sign of her. I'm scared. God, help me, I'm scared. The last few pages were torn out, leaving only a jagged edge where the final entry should have been. She didn't just disappear, I whispered, my voice trembling. Something took her. Thomas was pale, his eyes wide with fear. We need to go, man. Whatever's happening here, we need to leave. I wanted to agree, but as I stared at the photos, at the journal, a terrible thought crept into my mind. What if it's not over? I muttered. What if she's not the only one? Thomas frowned. What are you talking about? I hesitated, my throat dry. The voices. The ones she heard. I've been hearing them too. Thomas's face went white. What? I nodded, my heart pounding. Since I moved in. I didn't think much of it at first. Just strange noises, whispers, but now, I understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had been waiting for me. Part 7, The House's Hunger. I closed the journal with trembling hands, my mind racing. The house had been watching, waiting, just like it had with Marie. It didn't just haunt people, it consumed them, twisted their minds until they became part of its dark, suffocating history. We're leaving now, Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. I don't care what's going on here, I don't care about the voices, this place is evil. I wanted to agree, to run as far away as possible, but the pull of the house was stronger than ever. I could feel it, like an invisible hand wrapping around my chest, urging me to stay, to go deeper into its secrets. But I fought against it. I knew we had to get out before it was too late. "Okay," I said, my voice barely steady. "Let's go." We turned toward the attic door, but the moment we did, the temperature dropped again. The cold was biting now, almost painful, like winter winds cutting through flesh. And then, from behind us, I heard it, the whispering. This time, it wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping, echoing through the attic like a twisted chorus. The words were still unintelligible, but I could feel the malice behind them. The air grew heavier, the shadows deepening, stretching along the walls like they were reaching for us. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The whispering was growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just coming from the walls, it was coming from everywhere. Suddenly, the floor beneath us groaned, as though something massive was shifting beneath the house. The sound reverberated through the walls, making the entire attic tremble. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance, as the old wooden beams creaked and shuddered. Then, the whispers stopped, and everything went still. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel something in the air, thick and oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. And then, from behind the small attic door, came a sound that made my blood run cold, a slow, deliberate knocking. It was soft, almost gentle, but it echoed through the attic like thunder. "Someone's in there," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. No. No, that can't be possible. The knocking came again, louder this time. It was coming from behind the walls, from the very heart of the house. We needed to leave. Now. But before I could take a step toward the door, something slammed into the walls with a force so powerful, it shook the entire room. The floor beneath us buckled, sending both of us stumbling. I fell hard onto the floor, my flashlight skidding out of my hand and spinning into the darkness. "Get up! Get up!" Thomas screamed, pulling at my arm. I struggled to my feet, the entire attic shaking violently as if the house was tearing itself apart. But as I reached for the attic door, the walls, no, the house itself, let out a deafening roar. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the place. The floorboards splintered, and from the cracks, I could see movement, shadows twisting and writhing beneath the surface. Suddenly, the walls around us bulged, like something was pushing from the inside, straining to break free. The old plaster cracked, splitting wide, and from the gaps, I saw hands, dozens of them, small, skeletal, reaching out, clawing at the air. Thomas screamed, stumbling back as the hands grabbed at him, their bony fingers closing around his ankles. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, pulling him back, but more hands emerged from the cracks, their fingers digging into the wood, pulling themselves free from the walls. "Run!" I yelled, my voice barely audible over the sound of the house coming apart. We bolted toward the door, but as we reached the threshold, the door slammed shut on its own with a thunderous bang. I grabbed the handle, yanking it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The house wouldn't let us leave. Behind us, the attic groaned, the walls warping as more figures began to emerge from the cracks, twisted, gaunt forms, their hollow eyes fixed on us, their mouths stretched into silent screams. They were the same as the woman from the bedroom, the same as Marie. The house had consumed them, and now it wanted us. Thomas pounded on the door, his fists bloody from the effort. "It's not opening," he screamed, panic choking his voice. "It's not letting us out." I spun around, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures were closing in, their skeletal hands stretching toward us, their bodies twisting and contorting unnaturally as they moved. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its madness. "We're trapped," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it had us now. In the center of the room, the floor began to split open, revealing a gaping void beneath, a dark, endless pit that seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. The hands were coming from it, crawling up from the depths of the house, dragging themselves free. And in the center of the void, something was rising. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, began to emerge from the darkness. Its limbs were long and skeletal, its body twisted and grotesque. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, its eyes black and empty. It wasn't human. It was something far worse. Something ancient. Something hungry. The house let out another deafening roar, and the figure began to move toward us, its bony hands outstretched, as if to welcome us into its dark embrace. "Thomas!" I screamed, yanking on the door with all my strength. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The house went still, the roaring ceased, and the figures froze in place. The temperature plummeted again, and the air became heavy with a strange, oppressive silence. The door, unlocked. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Thomas by the arm and yanked him through the door, slamming it shut behind us as we tumbled down the stairs. The air in the rest of the house felt lighter, less oppressive, but I could still feel the darkness pressing in around us, the presence of the house clinging to our skin. We ran down the stairs, past the twisted decorations, the flickering pumpkin lamps, and the shattered remnants of what had once been a normal Halloween night. As we reached the front door, I glanced back at the house one last time. The walls, the floors, everything seemed to ripple, as if it was alive, watching us leave. The door creaked open before we could reach it, as though the house was letting us go. But I knew it wasn't over. The house wasn't finished with us yet. We stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. I could still feel the weight of the house behind me, its dark presence lingering, as if it was watching us from the windows. "We need to leave," Thomas panted, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We need to get as far away from this place as we can." I nodded, but as we stepped further from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. Not really. Because the whispers, they were still with me. Part 8, The House Always Wins. We stumbled into the street, gasping for air, but it felt like the night itself was pressing down on us. The moon was half hidden behind thick clouds, and the air was cold, unnaturally cold. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if it had never moved, never trembled, never unleashed whatever horror we had just escaped from. But it was alive. I could feel it, even now. Its presence lingered in the back of my mind, like a dark stain I couldn't scrub away. "We need to get the hell out of here," Thomas muttered, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with terror. "I can still hear them, those whispers." I nodded, but something was gnawing at me, deep down. I still felt the pull of the house, the strange compulsion to understand what was happening. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something worse, like the house had infected me. My thoughts were tangled with visions of those twisted figures in the attic, of Marie's gaunt face, and the journal's desperate scrawls. "Let's go," I said, forcing myself to move, to put one foot in front of the other. "We'll drive somewhere, anywhere. Just away." Thomas didn't argue. We hurried toward my car, parked in the driveway just a few feet away. The keys jingled in my hand, but when I tried to unlock the car, my hands were shaking too badly to fit the key into the lock. Come on," I muttered under my breath, cursing myself. Thomas kept glancing back at the house, his body tense like he was expecting it to come alive again at any moment. "Hurry up, man," he hissed. "I don't want to be here any longer than we have to." I finally managed to unlock the car, and we both jumped inside. I shoved the key into the ignition, but before I could turn it, something made me stop. The whispers, they were back. Soft. Insidious. crawling into my mind like tiny, icy fingers. I froze, my hand hovering over the key. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Thomas frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Let's go." But I wasn't listening to him. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They weren't coming from the house. They were coming from me. I closed my eyes, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of it. The words were disjointed at first, just fragments of sentences. But the more I focused, the more I could understand them. "You can't leave." The voice was faint, echoing in the corners of my mind. I shook my head, trying to push it away, but it clung to me, refusing to let go. "We are part of you now." "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No, you're not real." But the voice only laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent chills through my body. "You are ours." I opened my eyes, gasping for air. The car felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. I glanced over at Thomas, who was staring at me, wide-eyed, waiting for me to turn the key. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I wasn't okay. None of this was okay. The house was still inside me, like a parasite burrowing deeper into my mind. Without thinking, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights flickered on, cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the headlights illuminated the road ahead, my blood ran cold. Standing at the end of the driveway, just beyond the reach of the lights, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and impossibly still. It was the woman, Marie. She stood there, her head cocked to the side, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her mouth was open, just like before, twisted into that silent scream. "Drive, man!" Thomas shouted, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at her. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, waiting. The whispers in my head grew louder, more frantic. "She's not done with you, the house is not done with you." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "She's there," I whispered, my voice shaking. "She's standing right there." Thomas turned to look, squinting into the darkness. "What are you talking about?" "I don't see anything." But I could see her. Clear as day. She was closer now, just a few feet from the car, her eyes staring deep into mine, like she was looking straight into my soul. "She's here," I repeated, my voice hollow. "She's not going to let us go." The figure took a step forward, her body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on tangled strings. Her face contorted, and the air around us seemed to vibrate with a sickening energy. I slammed the car into reverse, my heart pounding, and gunned the engine. The tires screeched as we sped backward down the driveway, away from the house, away from her. I didn't care where we went, I just needed to get away. But as I hit the street and spun the car around, I felt it, the cold grip of the house, tightening around me. The whispers in my head were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices screaming for me to turn back. "You can't run from us." I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as we raced down the empty street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel steady, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let that thing take me. I wasn't going to let the house have me. "Where are we going?" Thomas yelled, gripping the dashboard as we sped around a corner. "I don't know." I shouted back. "Anywhere but here." But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. No matter how far we drove, no matter how fast we went, the house was still with us. I could feel it, inside my mind, inside my very soul. The whispers wouldn't stop. The cold wouldn't stop. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the car suddenly sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine died. No, no, no. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, but it was no use. The car coasted to a stop in the middle of the dark, empty road. I turned the key in the ignition again and again, but nothing happened. The engine was dead. "We're not stopping," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't stop." But we had stopped. And the moment we did, the air around us grew heavy again. The cold returned, seeping into the car, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. I stared out the windshield, my breath fogging up the glass. And then, slowly, the whispers quieted, replaced by something worse. Footsteps. Coming from the darkness. Coming toward the car. I looked over at Thomas, my heart hammering in my chest. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah. I hear it." The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind us. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved to the side of the car, circling us, slow and deliberate. Then, a hand. A pale, skeletal hand pressed against the passenger side window. The fingers were long and bony, the skin stretched tight over them. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Marie. I stared at the hand, my body frozen in terror. The fingers twitched, dragging slowly across the glass, leaving streaks of fog in their wake. "She's back," I whispered, my voice trembling. Thomas was shaking, his eyes locked on the window. "What do we do?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. I didn't know. The house wasn't done with us. The whispers, the figures, they had followed us, and now they were closing in. No matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we fought, we couldn't escape. Because the house, it always wins. Part 9, Nowhere Left to Run. The skeletal hand dragged slowly down the glass, leaving trails of condensation that streaked like blood. The sound, soft but unmistakable, was enough to turn my veins to ice. I could barely breathe. My fingers were locked around the steering wheel, gripping it as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. Marie's pale face appeared in the window. She stared through the glass, her black, empty eyes locking onto mine. Her mouth opened wide in that same, silent scream, lips stretched to the point of tearing, revealing rotting teeth behind cracked, bloodless lips. "She's here." Thomas screamed, his voice cracking as he recoiled from the window, pushing himself against the driver's seat, trying to get away from her. His breath was coming in short, panicked bursts. "We can't escape her. We can't." I wanted to scream too. I wanted to floor the gas, but the car was dead, the engine silent. We were trapped in the middle of a dark, empty road, surrounded by something that wasn't human, something that wasn't going to let us go. Then the whispers returned. "You are ours." They were louder this time, more insistent, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices. I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they only grew stronger, clawing at my sanity. "You can't escape us." Thomas was shaking, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the figure outside. "Why won't she go away?" he whispered, barely able to form the words. "Why won't she leave us alone?" "Because she can't," I muttered, more to myself than to him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She's part of the house. And the house, it's part of us now. The truth settled in like a heavy weight on my chest. The house wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, a hungry thing. And once it got its claws into you, it never let go. Marie wasn't just a ghost. She was something far worse, a victim, just like we were. The house had consumed her, twisted her, and now, it wanted us. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the roof of the car. Thomas screamed, jerking upright in his seat. I snapped my head up, my heart pounding. The car rocked slightly, as though something heavy had landed on top of it. "Jesus Christ, what the hell is happening?" Thomas whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. The car shook again, harder this time. Whatever was on the roof wasn't human. I could hear it moving, shifting, scraping its claws against the metal. I turned to Thomas, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of the car." His eyes widened in panic. "Are you out of your mind? We can't go out there." "She's out there." "I know," I said, my mind racing. "But we're sitting ducks in here. We need to make a run for it." "Run? Where?" He gestured wildly to the darkness around us. "There's nowhere to go. She'll follow us, no matter where we run." He was right. The house wasn't just behind us, it was with us. It had followed us, attached itself to us like a parasite, and now it was using Marie to drag us back. I glanced around, desperate for a plan, any plan. The road was deserted, no sign of life anywhere. But then my eyes fell on the tree line just a little ways ahead. The forest stretched out, a thick blanket of blackness. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was the only option we had. "The woods," I muttered, pointing toward the trees. "We'll lose her in the woods." Thomas looked at me like I was crazy, but before he could argue, the roof of the car dented with a loud thud, and the scraping sound intensified. Something was trying to get in. "Go. Go now," I yelled, shoving the door open. We tumbled out of the car, stumbling onto the cold, hard pavement. The air was colder now, biting at our skin, but we didn't stop. We ran, our footsteps pounding against the asphalt as we made a break for the woods. Behind us, the car groaned, and I could hear Marie's distorted, inhuman screech echoing through the night. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I'd freeze, and if I froze, I'd never move again. We hit the tree line at full speed, branches whipping against our faces as we plunged into the darkness. The woods were thick, the trees towering over us like sentinels. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning from the cold air, but I kept running, kept pushing forward. The whispers followed us, echoing through the trees, as if the woods themselves were alive, calling us back. Thomas tripped and fell, crashing to the ground with a shout. I turned back, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him to his feet. "Come on. We have to keep moving." But the moment I got him up, I heard it, a rustling sound, coming from the trees ahead of us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were deathly silent now, save for the faint rustling of leaves. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "She's here, she's following us." I held my breath, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, closer, but it wasn't coming from behind us. It was coming from in front of us. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint moonlight that filtered through the trees. I stumbled back, my blood turning to ice. It was her. But it wasn't Marie this time. This figure was different, taller, more twisted, with long, clawed fingers and a face that was a grotesque mockery of human features. Its eyes were black holes, endless and empty, and its mouth was a wide, gaping maw, filled with jagged teeth. The creature took a step toward us, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring the moment. "Oh God," Thomas whimpered, backing away. Oh God, what is that?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The creature reached out, its claws extending toward us, and the air around us seemed to freeze. I could feel its hunger, its malice, radiating from it in waves. It was part of the house, another victim, and it had been sent to drag us back. I grabbed Thomas by the arm, yanking him back. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the trees, our footsteps frantic and uneven. The creature let out a guttural screech, and I could hear it tearing through the underbrush behind us, moving faster than anything should be able to move. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The trees whipped past us in a blur, and the branches scratched at our faces and arms, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear. The whispers were louder now, filling my head, suffocating me with their relentless presence. You can't escape. I could hear the creature gaining on us, its footsteps heavy and thunderous, and I knew we were running out of time. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I forced myself to keep going, to keep running. Suddenly, the ground dropped beneath me, and I stumbled forward, crashing down a steep embankment. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, and I rolled down the slope, dirt and rocks tearing at my skin. I came to a stop at the bottom, gasping for air, my body trembling from the impact. I could hear Thomas crashing down behind me, cursing as he tumbled into the darkness. When I finally managed to pull myself to my feet, I realized we had reached a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. The moonlight barely reached the ground here, but I could see well enough to know that we were cornered. There was no way out. Thomas scrambled to his feet beside me, his face pale, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't outrun her." I looked around, searching for anything, any way out, but there was nothing. Just trees and darkness. We were trapped. And then, from the shadows, the creature emerged again, its black eyes gleaming in the faint light. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew we had nowhere to go. Its claws scraped against the ground, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "We're not leaving here alive," Thomas muttered, his voice barely more than a breath. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we'd find a way out, but the truth was sinking in. The house had followed us. The creature was part of it, an extension of its hunger, and no matter how far we ran, no matter how fast, it would always be one step ahead. Because we weren't just running from a house. We were running from something that had become a part of us. The whispers echoed through the trees, louder now, more insistent. They were all around us, in our heads, in our very souls. "You are ours." The creature lunged. Part 10, The House Claims Its Own. The creature lunged, its twisted form blurring as it closed the distance between us in an instant. Its claws gleamed in the faint moonlight, each one sharp enough to slice through flesh with ease. Thomas screamed, stumbling back, but there was nowhere to run. Time seemed to slow as the thing's hand swiped through the air, heading straight for me. I threw myself to the side, the claws grazing my shoulder, leaving a trail of burning pain. I hit the ground hard, my body skidding across the dirt, but I didn't have time to think about the pain. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. The creature turned its black, hollow eyes toward me again, and I could feel its hunger, its rage. "Run!" Thomas screamed, but I didn't move. There was nowhere to go. The creature's mouth stretched wider, that grotesque grin spreading across its face, as it advanced slowly, savoring the moment. The whispers were deafening now, filling the air, filling my head. "You are ours. You can't escape. The house always wins." I could feel my grip on reality slipping, the house's influence twisting my thoughts, warping my fear into something darker, more primal. My body ached, my head throbbed, and all I could think was that it had been a mistake to run. There was no escape from the house, there never had been. It had claimed Marie, and now it was going to claim us. But something snapped inside me, a surge of desperate anger cutting through the terror. I wasn't going to go down like this. I wasn't going to let this thing win. If the house wanted us, it would have to fight. The creature lunged again, faster this time, its claws aiming for my chest. I barely managed to dodge, stumbling out of the way just in time. I grabbed a large branch from the ground, swinging it wildly. It connected with the creature's arm with a sickening crack, but the thing didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. Thomas was on his feet now, grabbing rocks and hurling them at the creature, but they bounced off its twisted form like pebbles. "We can't fight this," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "It's too strong." I swung the branch again, harder this time, hitting the creature square in the side. It staggered for a moment, just long enough for me to yell, "Run!" Thomas hesitated, looking at me like he couldn't believe what I was saying. "Go!" I screamed. "Get out of here!" His eyes widened in panic, but he nodded, turning and sprinting toward the trees. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to buy us time. If one of us could get away, maybe there was still hope. Maybe one of us could survive. The creature's head snapped toward Thomas as he disappeared into the woods, but I wasn't about to let it follow him. I swung the branch again, catching the thing in the back. It let out a horrible screech, like nails on a chalkboard, and turned its attention back to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, trying to lead the creature further into the clearing, away from Thomas. Its eyes never left me, its twisted grin stretching wider, more grotesque. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, the whispers filling my mind, making it harder to think, harder to fight. "You can't escape." The creature lunged again, faster than I could react. Its claws raked across my side, tearing through fabric and skin. Pain exploded in my ribs, hot and sharp, but I didn't have time to scream. I stumbled, blood seeping from the wound, but I forced myself to stay on my feet. I wasn't going to give in. But the creature was relentless. It circled me, its dark eyes gleaming with malice, and I could feel its hunger, its need to devour me, to consume my soul like it had consumed all the others. It wasn't just an extension of the house, it was the house's hunger, its insatiable desire for more. I swung the branch again, but this time it barely made contact before the creature knocked it aside with a single swipe of its claws. My weapon was gone, and I was out of options. It closed the distance between us in a flash, its bony fingers wrapping around my throat, lifting me off the ground with impossible strength. I gasped, clawing at its hand, but it was like trying to fight stone. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges. "You are ours now," the whispers hissed, filling my ears, echoing in my skull. "The house takes what it wants." My feet kicked helplessly, my body growing weaker as the creature's grip tightened. The pain in my side throbbed, and I could feel my strength fading, slipping away. This was it. The house had won. But then, through the fog of pain and terror, I heard something. A voice, a familiar voice, calling my name. "Becca." It was Thomas. Somehow, he had come back. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, its grip loosening just enough for me to gasp for air. I looked over, struggling to focus, and saw Thomas standing at the edge of the clearing, holding something in his hands. A matchbook. "No," the whispers hissed, growing frantic, desperate. Thomas struck a match, and in the dim light, I saw what he was holding, a bottle of lighter fluid. My eyes widened as I realized what he was planning. The house, the creature, it wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something physical, something tied to the very fabric of the house. And fire could destroy it. The creature screeched, dropping me to the ground as it lunged toward Thomas, but he was faster. He doused the match in the lighter fluid and flung it at the creature's feet. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then the fire ignited. The flames roared to life, engulfing the creature's legs, crawling up its twisted body like it had been waiting for this moment. The creature screeched, flailing as the fire consumed it, its black eyes wide with panic. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the fire spread, leaping from the creature to the trees, to the ground, to everything. The entire clearing lit up, the flames casting wild shadows against the trees as the air filled with the stench of burning flesh. Thomas ran toward me, pulling me to my feet. "Come on. We need to go before the fire spreads." I nodded weakly, my body trembling from exhaustion and pain, but I forced myself to move. We stumbled through the trees, the fire crackling behind us, the screams of the creature echoing in the distance. The house was burning. The whole thing was burning. As we ran, I could feel the weight of the house lifting, the darkness that had clung to me for so long finally beginning to loosen its grip. The whispers were fading, growing weaker, drowned out by the roar of the flames. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, gasping for air, our bodies covered in dirt and ash. I collapsed onto the pavement, my chest heaving, my side burning with pain, but for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt free. Thomas knelt beside me, his face pale but determined. "It's over," he said, his voice shaky but full of relief. "We did it. We beat it." I nodded, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. But as the flames flickered in the distance, lighting up the night sky, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Because deep down, I knew the truth. The house wasn't just bricks and wood. It wasn't just a place. It was something more. Something ancient. And fire couldn't destroy something like that. It would come back. It always came back. Part 11, The Smoldering Ruins. We sat on the cold pavement, gasping for breath, our bodies battered and bruised, our minds barely able to comprehend what had just happened. The flickering flames in the distance marked the spot where the house once stood, now just a smoldering skeleton of what it had been. But even as I stared at the distant fire, something inside me refused to believe it was truly over. The house, the whispers, that monstrous creature, it felt like we had only delayed the inevitable. Thomas sat beside me, hunched over, his hands shaking. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He had saved my life, and we had escaped, but there was no relief in his expression. No victory. "I thought it would feel different," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought, burning it down would be the end." I didn't respond. I wanted to tell him that it was over, that we were safe, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Because deep down, I didn't believe it. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, watching the fire slowly die, the orange glow fading into the blackness of the night. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened, the creature, the whispers, the attic. I could still feel the weight of the house, the way it had clung to me, invaded my thoughts. Even now, sitting far away from the ruins, I could still hear it. Faint, distant, but there. The fire department showed up after what felt like an eternity. The flashing lights cut through the darkness as the firefighters jumped out of their trucks, racing toward the smoldering remains of the house. Thomas and I didn't move. We just watched as they worked, spraying water over the charred wood, pulling hoses through the broken yard. "Do you think," Thomas started, his voice trembling. "Do you think it's really gone?" I didn't answer at first. I wanted to believe that we had destroyed it, that fire had been enough. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the house wasn't something you could just burn away. It wasn't physical, not in the way we understood. It had roots that went deeper than we could ever reach. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I really don't know." Thomas looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. He didn't press the issue. I think, on some level, he knew the answer. Already. The fire crew worked for hours, and when they were done, only the blackened skeleton of the house remained, a burnt-out husk, surrounded by the smoldering ruins of what had once been a home. The old, warped beams had collapsed inward, leaving the structure barely standing. We sat in silence as the fire chief approached, his face grim. "You two okay?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Physically, we were alive, but inside, I felt like the house had taken something from me, something I would never get back. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, looking between us and the charred remains of the house. "Was there anyone else inside?" I shook my head slowly. "No. Just us." He stared at us for a long moment, his eyes narrowing like he didn't believe me. But he didn't push it. Instead, he sighed, glancing back at the wreckage. "Looks like an old place," he muttered. Probably caught fire from faulty wiring or something. You're lucky to be alive. I didn't correct him. Let him believe it was a simple accident. I wasn't about to explain the nightmare that had unfolded inside those walls. I wasn't even sure I could explain it. Thanks, I muttered, not meeting his gaze. The fire chief nodded, then turned and walked back toward his crew, shouting orders to pack up and clear out. The flashing lights of the fire trucks illuminated the blackened ruins, casting eerie shadows across the twisted remnants of the house. We should go, Thomas said, standing up slowly, wincing from the pain in his side. I followed him, my body aching with every step. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving me feeling weak, fragile, like I could collapse at any moment. But something pulled me forward, kept me moving, even as my legs screamed for rest. We walked to the edge of the property, but before we reached the street, I stopped. Something wasn't right. Wait, I whispered, my heart skipping a beat. Thomas turned to look at me, confused. What? What is it? I stared at the house, the ruins barely visible now that the fire had died down. The firefighters were packing up, ready to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. Something unfinished. Just wait, I muttered, taking a few hesitant steps toward the remains. I couldn't explain what I was doing. It was like an invisible thread was pulling me back toward the house. I moved closer, my eyes locked on the smoldering wreckage, and the closer I got, the stronger the feeling became. Becca! Thomas called out. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I just kept moving. Something was calling me, from the house. I could feel it, deep in my bones, like a low hum vibrating through the earth beneath my feet. The whispers, they were back. And then, as I reached the edge of the ruins, I saw it. There, in the blackened, twisted remains of the house, was a door. A door that shouldn't be there. It was standing perfectly intact, as though the fire hadn't touched it. The wood was dark, polished, and smooth, with the same strange symbols carved into it that I had seen in the attic. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my pulse racing. Becca, don't! Thomas shouted, running toward me. Don't go near it. But I couldn't help myself. The door was impossible, and yet it was there, calling me. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out, my fingers brushing against the cold wood. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. It was like the world had been muted, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. The door swung open. Behind it, there was no room. No charred remnants of the house. No walls, no floor. Just darkness. An endless, yawning void of blackness. And from that void, something moved. A shape, tall and twisted, its form barely visible in the shadows. But I knew what it was. I knew who it was. Marie. She stepped forward, her gaunt, skeletal form emerging from the darkness, her hollow eyes locking onto mine. She was smiling, that grotesque grin spreading across her face. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? She whispered, her voice soft but filled with malice. The door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, and I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. The house, it wasn't done with us. It wasn't done with me. I turned and ran, my legs shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Thomas grabbed my arm as I reached him, his eyes wide with terror. What the hell happened? He demanded. I couldn't answer him. All I could do was stare back at the house, at the door that had disappeared into the wreckage, and the darkness that still lingered in the corners of my mind. It's not over, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's never over. Part 12, The House Never Lets Go. We stood on the edge of the smoldering ruins, Thomas gripping my arm as though it were the only thing tethering him to reality. My legs felt weak, trembling with the weight of what we had just witnessed. The house was supposed to be gone, reduced to ash and memory, but that door, the door that shouldn't exist, had shown me the truth. This nightmare wasn't over. Becca, what the hell is going on? Thomas's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze of fear clouding my mind. His wide eyes searched mine, desperate for an explanation, but how could I explain something I barely understood myself? I swallowed hard, glancing back at the ruins, expecting the door to reappear, expecting Marie's twisted, skeletal form to come crawling out of the darkness. But the ruins were quiet again. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only the hollow shell of a house that still felt alive. I saw her, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Marie, she was there. She came through the door. She said. I couldn't finish the sentence. It felt too absurd, too impossible to say aloud. But the words rang in my head, echoing like the whispers that had haunted me for days. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? Thomas shook his head, still gripping my arm. This is insane. This whole thing is insane. The house is gone. We burned it to the ground. I looked at him, the panic rising in my chest. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. The house isn't just wood and stone. It's alive. And it's not done with us. He stared at me, shaking his head in disbelief. No. No, that's not possible. We're both just in shock. It's over, Becca. It has to be over. But it wasn't. I could feel it in my bones, in the back of my mind, the same way I had felt the pull of the house from the moment I set foot in it. The fire hadn't destroyed it. It had only made it angry. I pulled away from Thomas, my heart racing, and took a few steps toward the ruins. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as far from this cursed place as possible, but something inside me, something I couldn't control, drew me closer. The ground was still warm beneath my feet, the ashes smoldering in the cool night air. I stood at the edge of what had once been the front door, staring into the hollow remains of the house. The moon cast long shadows over the blackened beams and charred walls, but the darkness felt deeper than it should have been. And then I saw it. A shape, barely visible, moving through the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears as I strained to see it more clearly. At first, I thought it was Marie again, her twisted form crawling through the wreckage. But as the figure emerged from the darkness, I realized it wasn't her. It was something else, something worse. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body distorted and elongated, its limbs too long, its fingers too sharp. Its face was a blank canvas, a smooth, featureless void, and yet, it felt like it was staring directly at me. The air around me seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping rapidly, and I could hear the faintest whispers, soft, insidious, creeping into my mind. You are part of the house now, you always have been. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, as the figure moved closer, its body shifting unnaturally, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. The closer it got, the louder the whispers became, filling my head with a cacophony of voices, all of them saying the same thing. You belong to us. No. I screamed, covering my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, drowning out everything else. The figure loomed over me now, its long, skeletal fingers reaching toward me. Becca. Thomas's voice broke through the noise, snapping me out of the trance. I turned, gasping for breath, and saw him running toward me, his face pale with fear. Get away from it, he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back from the ruins. The figure stopped, its faceless head tilting slightly as it watched us. The whispers quieted, fading into the background, but the air was still thick with its presence. It was waiting. Run, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We have to run. Thomas didn't argue. We turned and bolted down the road, our footsteps pounding against the pavement, the cold night air biting at our skin. I didn't dare look back, I didn't want to see if the thing was following us. I could feel it, though, lingering just behind us, watching. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the small town, the lights from the street lamps casting a faint glow over the empty road. I collapsed onto the curb, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. Thomas crouched beside me, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, wiping the sweat from my brow. "But it's part of the house. It's part of us now." Thomas stared at me, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about? What do you mean, part of us?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic that was clawing at my chest. "The house, it's not just a place. It's alive. It's in us, Thomas. It's been in us since the moment we stepped inside." His face went pale, and I could see the realization dawning on him. He shook his head, backing away slightly. "No. No, that can't be. We burned it down. We destroyed it." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "You can't destroy something like that. The fire didn't kill it. It only made it stronger." We sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of what I had said sinking in. The house wasn't gone. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Finally, Thomas broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. The whispers were quieter now, but I could still feel them, lingering at the edges of my mind, waiting for their moment. The house wasn't finished with us. Not yet. And maybe, it never would be. I looked up at the sky, at the stars shining faintly through the clouds, and I knew, deep down, that no matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, the house would always be with us. Because it wasn't just a house. It was a hunger. A darkness. And it had claimed us. The end.